Well, I'm the type of guy who never settles down. Pretty girls are, you know that I'm around. Kiss them and I love them, 'cause to me they're all the same. I hug them and I squeeze them, they don't even know my name. I'm the wanderer, yeah, I'm the wanderer. I roam around and round and round and round. Hello and welcome to Choice Conversations. I'm your host, Chris Stefanik. So as some of you may know, a while back I did a parenting podcast with Kevin Geary called Reboot Your Kids. Now, that podcast, we ended up discontinuing it as Kevin just ran out of time. He didn't have the time to keep recording the episodes. They were interview formats, and they ran from like an hour to an hour and a half. And with the work he's putting into his other podcast and the Rebooted Body service that he runs and that he makes his living off of that, he just didn't have the time to have a podcast of that nature. Having said that, he has since started a new parenting podcast that is a much shorter format. He is, because he's so passionate about parenting, this new podcast, the Powerful Parenting Podcast, he is going to answer listener questions, just taking one question per podcast, maybe a 10 or 15 minute podcast where he helps the listeners to work through their issues. So I encourage you to check out the Powerful Parenting Podcast. Really good stuff. In the meantime, I've decided that I am going to put the Reboot Your Kids podcast into the Choice Conversations feed as part of this switching from the Reboot Your Kids podcast to the Powerful Parenting Podcast. The old podcasts were taken down on the Reboot Your Kids website, so you cannot get them there any longer. And I thought just for posterity's sake, it would be great to have them available so that they could help other parents going forward. So with that in mind, I'm just going to put them into the Choice Conversations feed over the next few weeks. And if you haven't listened to them, enjoy them. If you have already listened to them in the past, feel free to skip them or give them a second listen. But I just thought I'd give you a heads up on why you're now seeing Reboot Your Kids. Now, in this episode, Kevin and I review an article that he wrote on the Reboot Your Kids blog. It's titled, 12 Absurd Arguments Peaceful Parents Are Sick of Hearing. This is one he wrote, like a year ago, something like that. And it went viral, or at least relatively went viral compared to the other content that he posts. Got a whole bunch of comments, a whole bunch of shares on Facebook and retweets and the like on Twitter. And we decided to review the article and the comments. So this is actually part 2. In part 1, we go over the article itself. And in this one, part 2, we go over the comments that were left by people who read the blog. If you haven't listened to part 1, I recommend you do that one first and then come back here. Or if you don't care about that sort of thing and you're just willing to dive right in the middle, then don't let me stop you. Go ahead and give this one a listen. All right. I hope you enjoy it. Here it is.
I will move into a couple of the comments that I highlighted, and I'll just have you respond to them, basically, and then if there's anything to clean up, I'll chime in. So the first one says, great article, but I have to agree with Hannah, who is another commenter. I was so excited to post this on my wall for all those that advocate spanking to see. But the comment about the black community stopped me. Not that it's racist, but it casts negative light primarily on the black community. I have a lot of black friends, being South African, and I just know that this would hurt them and make them angry and defensive. It may be a fact, but some facts can be used more discreetly. I don't think this one was necessary. It just spoiled what was otherwise a great article. I think if you add a reference to where the information was found, it may look a little better.
I mean, I get what they're saying. You know, race is a really touchy issue in the United States, and a lot of people would just rather not even go down that road. You know, and so she's saying, why did you go down this road? I would never have done that. You know, I mean, in some cases, I mean, I would say it's pretty much, it's ridiculous. The whole, so much of what goes on in the race issue in the U.S. and presumably other countries is pretty ridiculous. I mean, if we can't say that, there's X amount of violence in the black community according to Y study, then why can't we say, according to this study, men live to be, on average 4 years, 4 years less than, they live 4 years less than women do. You know what I mean? It's like, well, that's sexist then. It's like, well, it's just numbers in the study.
Right.
There's nothing sexist about it. There's nothing racist in citing numbers in a study. And there is definitely a lack of maturity in U.S. culture on the subject of race that, is highlighted by this. I understand you can be very mature on the subject of race and still say, you know what, I know other people are not, and so therefore I'm not going to post this link because I know other people are not. So I kind of see where she's coming from, or she. I don't know if it's a she or he, but so I hear the criticism. It's a shame that it even needs to be made. It only really applies to people who are not very mature in their thinking on the subject of race, and so maybe this is something where you intentionally included this as something to weed out people that don't think very logically, and then just their emotional triggers fire off. I'm not sure, but that's my thoughts on it. What are yours?
All right, so I'll reserve my thoughts till after the next comment, which is kind of along the same lines, but I think it opens the door for more discussion. So the next one is, that said, my major concern is that I think you are deeply oversimplifying the problem of violence and crime in communities of color. What about the systematic marginalization of black citizens? What about poorly serviced neighborhoods and subpar schools? What about the impact of poverty on youth crime rates? Your article seems to blame an already disadvantaged group for their own suffering. This isn't our fault. Maybe if you stopped hitting she's quoting me, sorry. This isn't our fault. Maybe if you stopped hitting your kids, they'd behave better. The problem is so much deeper than that. You seem to have great tools, and I believe that wasn't an exact quote. She's paraphrasing. You seem to have great tools to offer a marginalized community to learn to parent more compassionately and peacefully. I'd love to see you work as an ally instead of creating blame and division.
I mean, to one extent, certainly there are more variables of what's going on in the black community than just their parenting tactics. But, I mean, at the same time, I mean, I see your point. I mean, that's such a glaring example. I mean, it's one of the best examples you could have used, because it's like, okay, there's this huge disparity in violence among the black community. And there's a pretty big disparity in that they hit their kids a lot more than any other community, Right. So, and the point we're talking about is, the argument is, beat respect
right.
into children. That
right.
if you hit them, the more you hit them, the less they're going to hit others. The more. So it's a really great example because of those. They're at the opposite ends of the spectrum. And of course, my phone is ringing now.
Well, I'll jump in and say basically that, first off, there's another fallacy here that she says you're oversimplifying the problem of violence and crime in communities of color. Well, first of all, I'm not talking about communities of color. I'm talking about the black community. I'm talking about a single community. I'm not talking about multiple communities. That's one issue. The second issue is that I'm not oversimplifying the problem of violence, because I wasn't talking about the problem of violence. I wasn't talking about the cause of the problem of violence. I was arguing against the efficacy of hitting people to decrease violence, right? And the only way to do that is to say, okay, well, let's figure out which community tends to be the most violent disproportionately, all right? Let's look and see which community that is. Oh, here's X community here. Now, does this community use corporal punishment? Oh, look. They use corporal punishment at a rate that exceeds all other communities. So they hit people more often and they commit the most amount of crime, that doesn't bode well for the argument that hitting people creates respectful people. So I used the argument, and I didn't really use this to be controversial. I kept it in there because I knew it would probably be controversial, but I didn't come up with it to be controversial. I came up with it because it's the fact. Now, let's say, what is that community called? How do you want me to describe them? There is a group of community right here. Now, I can easily say they're black because they are. Now, I don't know what other descriptive term I would use. It has nothing to do with race. It has to do with X community commits violence disproportionately, and they also hit their kids disproportionately. That's all the argument is. So I said in the comments, I don't care if they're purple. I don't care if they're from Mars. It's just a community, and black is the only way to describe them.
Yeah, I don't know. Was when I was listening to the comment, it sounded less about it being a racial thing and more about it just being like, look, there's a lot of variables going on here. And in that respect, the commenter was correct. There are a lot of variables. But in defense of the argument you presented, there have been plenty of studies on spanking. You know, like we earlier were saying, about there should be a blog post about the scientific evidence behind this. There are plenty of studies that show the more a child experiences violence, including just spanking, the more violent they are. And this is regardless of color. This is regardless of class, regardless of the education of that they're receiving or the education of their parents. You know, a kid in a private school who's spanked is more likely to be violent. A white kid in a private school is more likely to be spanked than a white kid in a private school who isn't spanked,
right?
Who's negotiated with. And I mean, it's the studies are pretty clear across the board. When you remove all these variables and not just hone in on one subject group, which might not be representative of the human race as a whole, and so therefore you get some variables that are maybe coloring the results. That's probably not a good choice of words, but you get the results could be tainted because, well, that group also so happens to be more likely to be of a lower class than let's say the white community, or you know what I mean? That group also so happens to be more likely to have a single parent household than the white community or something like that. And so, I mean, in a sense, I think their argument, if your argument is, hey, that argument doesn't hold up because you're ignoring these other variables, there's some validity to that. But there is other science out there that backs up the argument.
If you're arguing the cause, which I wasn't arguing at all the cause. In fact, in the comments section, I said very, very specifically, violence in the black community is multifactorial. It is not just associated with their use of corporal punishment. Absolutely not. In fact, a lot of it is completely unfair and oppressive at what's happened. And this is probably a large degree of the reason of the high violent crime rates in the black community. But in my argument, I wasn't talking about the cause. Not at all. All I'm arguing against is the efficacy of hitting people to diminish violence, right? And I'm just showing that hasn't happened in this particular community.
Right.
So,
yeah, I mean, I don't think the argument you made was a bad one. I think it's a good one because there's such a huge disparity of the amount of blacks. I mean, it's like, if you look at the statistics, I mean, I don't know, it's like you're 40 times more likely to kill someone in the United States if you're black than if you're white or something. I mean, the statistics are really, really glaring for, you know, there being more violence in the black community and being less violence, you know, and it's also pretty glaring in that they use corporal punishment more often. So I think it's a good example, but at the same time, I don't think that person's arguments were necessarily wrong, because when you hone it, you know, when you have a sample size like that's not representative of the whole population, mm-hmm. then other factors do creep in. So that's all I'm saying.
Okay. All right, this article appeared in my Facebook. Oh, and I'll just say, in the context, when you were mentioning that they weren't necessarily talking about, the racial aspect of this, in context, there were about 30 comments that I had to delete. Some of these comments were linked to other people's comments, and those ones that got deleted were only deleted because they contained no argument. They contained all basically just hatred and you are a racist, and there was nothing productive in the comment. It was just a bunch of personal attacks, and I didn't want to cloud the comment section with a bunch of that nonsense, so I had to delete them. But in the context, it was 99% people just saying I'm being racist, and that's that.
Right, and that's obviously ridiculous. This goes back to what we were saying, that people are really lacking maturity in the subject of race. If you can't say that X study gave Y results without being labeled as a racist, then that's a real problem.
Right. All right, so this article appeared in my Facebook page, and I found it quite disturbing. First of all, your final point about moms playing the victim role is exactly what this article is enabling many others to do. Don't judge me, and I'm better than you is the tone I get from this. Secondly, your comment about mainstream parents implies you believe most people are beating their kids, spanking, judging, when in reality I've never heard anyone try to argue one of your 12 facts ever. Nor do I know anyone who spanks or beats their children. I don't know who your friends are, but I'm sorry if these are the kind of people you surround yourself with. You have exaggerated the level of criticism of your parenting style in order to sell something.
Well, wow. So, are you judging and saying I'm better than you? You're definitely judging. There was a judgmental, there's some moralistic judging going on in there. There's definitely some jackal judging going on in there. I would say that is accurate. There is definitely some judging going on here. Saying that I'm better than you, I don't know that you actually say how you raise your kids. There are people who are smokers who tell people not to smoke. So that doesn't mean they're necessarily saying they're better. You could write this article and be somebody who spanks your kids, I guess, in theory. Mm-hmm. You don't say in there, I don't spank my kids. At least maybe you did, but I didn't see it. So I think that's just kind of projection or whatever.
I think perhaps they feel less than because of the critical nature of what we're talking about, and that's what they're expressing.
Yeah, I guess when if you feel like somebody's judging you, then they're like looking down on you, I guess. Probably says more about you than it does about them, but so be it. I've never heard these arguments before, and I don't know anybody who spanks their kids thing. All right, so my guess is...
Find that hard to believe?
This is somebody who probably keeps the conversation at the level of chit-chat, and so they don't know that their kids the people around them are spanking their kids.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't get these arguments because they're not ever talking about how I don't spank my kids and I think this is good. Because spanking is a volatile subject.
Mm-hmm.
People have an emotional reaction to it because of all these things we've talked about. The not wanting to feel like they're being bad parents, not wanting to feel like their parents were bad parents to them, etc. So there's a lot of emotional volatility, and it's not as high as race, but when you go talking about race, that you're potentially lighting a powder keg, and it's the same thing with spanking, just maybe to a lesser degree. So my guess is this person is not going very deep with the people that are around them, and that's why they don't know that the people around them are in fact authoritarian and are spanking, and that they're not ever engaging in these kind of topics, which to them are probably they're off limits to go to these kind of topics, which is what most people that are locked in the mainstream paradigm there's a certain set of topics that are off limits, and so my guess is this is one of those people.
And nobody should ever debate, and nobody should ever argue, and we should all just always constantly get along. And if people are beating their kids, then that's their business, and it has nothing to do with me. And so I see this a lot, I think, in people who struggle with people pleasing. That they want to be 100% accepted, and they care deeply about what other people think about them and think about their thoughts. And thus, when they are with people, you're right, they don't engage in anything beyond chit-chat. They never, ever touch on a subject that would be even remotely controversial, because that would open the door for them to be judged, for them to be possibly rejected, or for to have their ideas rejected. And because they are a people pleaser, they're deeply uncomfortable with that.
Right, yeah. It's like you can't open the door to the abortion issue and say, without taking a stand,
Right.
I mean, it's like you're either for it or you're against it. If you say, well, I'm just not sure.
That's even objectionable. Right?
Yeah, I mean,
you don't care about the outcome? Yeah. So you have to. Yeah, you have to take a stand.
Right.
All right, so she also says, this one really was frustrating. You are also implying that if you practice peaceful parenting, your children will be perfect adults who never speed or lose a job or face a consequence. I do agree with the nonviolent message you are sending. I believe children should be raised in happy homes with loving parents, but sooner or later the world is going to hand out consequences, whether you do as a parent or not. Kids are not perfect. They are going to make mistakes, and not everything is going to go their way all of the time.
So it seems like a false dichotomy here. I guess what she's saying is, I'm not even sure what she's saying, because it's like, okay, yeah, the world's going to dish out consequences, and the child will learn from that. They don't have to get the consequences from you. Well, even there's going to be some consequences, because part of this, what we've been talking about here, negotiation. Whenever you're negotiating with people, there are consequences involved of, if you're going to keep your end of the bargain or not. It might not be beating the person's ass, but it's well, we were going to go to the park today. If you cleaned up the mess you made in the living room, you didn't do it, so we're not going to go. That doesn't mean you negotiated that. The child agreed to it. You didn't force him into it. You know what I mean? It doesn't mean I don't know.
Okay, so here,
I'm not even sure what that is even saying.
I'll explain it. Do you want me to explain it?
Yeah.
Okay. Because I get this all the time. I see this all the time. This is how you discern somebody who is trying to follow your logic or trying to reason their argument, but is too emotional to do so. So this is the classic in AA. It's not an argument. But what people will do is they will give their opinion about a topic, right? Or give their opinion about a subsection of the topic rather than actually make an argument. And people will almost always say something that's factually accurate. So she said that sooner or later the world is going to hand out consequences because kids are not perfect. That's a factual statement, but it has nothing to do with anything we're talking about. It's not an argument. It's a factual statement, but it doesn't apply in the context of the situation. This is like you say 2 + 2 = 4, and rather than the person trying to agree or disagree with that statement, they go on a long emotional diatribe about math. And they may say some factual things about math in this diatribe, but it has nothing to do with the argument that 2 + 2 = 4. And this is really, really common online. So she's just telling you her thoughts telling me about her thoughts about parenting, but she's not making an argument. She wants to object to what I'm saying, but she's not making an argument as she does so.
Yeah, that's really the point. People don't know how to make an argument. They don't know how to organize their own thoughts clearly. That's what I was saying. I'm sitting there trying to respond to it, and I'm like, you know what? I don't even know what the hell she's saying.
Right. You can't.
Because, I was almost going to say, well, she's making a straw man, which is that kids are not perfect, and therefore this won't work. But then she said she agrees with your peaceful method of parenting. So I'm like, well, what the hell is she actually saying?
Right.
And it's right. You're right. There is no if A, then B. There is no
There's no argument.
forming of an argument.
Yeah. But she did make a straw man. So the straw man was in the beginning when she said, if you imply that if you practice peaceful parenting, your children will be perfect adults who never speed or lose. And I did never imply that. I never implied that kids will be perfect if you peacefully parent them. That's a straw man argument.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is why, it's frustrating oftentimes to have these conversations with people. And the biggest thing is I allow these things on the site, even though it distracts from the conversation. It's difficult to follow and all that stuff. But what I don't allow ad hominem attacks. So if you just ad hominem attack somebody, like, your comment's not going to get posted. But please, like, if you're listening and you want to make an argument, you can see that we're quite willing to have a discussion about it and hear your arguments. But it has to actually be an argument. It can't just be your emotional thoughts on an issue. You have to, if you want to object to something, then choose that something and object to it. Try not to cloud it with all of these other facts and opinions, right? Like, keep the discussion on track.
Yeah. No, I agree.
All right, so let's see. What I don't understand is never telling your kid no, ... I don't need to read the rest. So that's a straw man. I never said that you should never tell your kid no. So again, if you're going to argue against something, you have to quote the person what they actually said. You can't paraphrase or say what you believe you thought they meant. You have to actually choose what they actually said and make an argument against it. So otherwise, it's a straw man. So I'll just skip that one. We'll do this one as the last one.
Oh, man, you're killing me, Kevin. I love the argument. But you said, well, Chris, ... and so you're wrong.
Right. Exactly.
That's my favorite tactic. Gone. Damn it.
All right. So I'm sorry, but who are you to comment on my mental health? You assume that everyone that got spanked by his or her parents and tells others that he's fine is automatically lying, fucked up in the mind, repressing a trauma, blah, blah, blah. Seriously, have you ever thought of actually talking and listening to those that didn't have an issue with it? Not every child grows up to be a special snowflake that instantly cries abuse when he learns that his parents hit him or her. Example, myself. I was spanked when I was younger and did something very bad. How did all of this turn out? Well, I'm an airliner pilot. I rarely drink. I have confidence in myself and my abilities. I love my parents to death and do not have any trauma whatsoever. But by all means, tell me how I'm not qualified to know how I feel because, I got spanked, so I must be fucked up in the head.
Well, there's this argument that I was spanked and I turned out all right. And, like you said, how do you know you turned out all right? And maybe, how do you know you wouldn't have been better? That's the one thing that people don't seem to get, is you can have some standards like, hey, if I'm making a fair amount of money, airline pilot is probably, doing pretty well. If I have a good relationship with my parents, if I have a good relationship with my kids and I'm not divorced or whatever, then I'm doing all right. And you can come up with whatever standards it is. But the argument isn't really that, well, I guess maybe in your argument where you're like, they're fucked up, insecure and all that, maybe that was your argument. But to me, the argument is not so much, are you making a lot of money? Are you having a good relationship with your parents or whatever? It's, would you have been better off? Who knows where you would be right now? Yeah, okay, if maybe money is your standard and you were able to, that's the thing that you're going for, and you're able to, with your current amount of psychological health, to get a job making $80,000 a year flying a plane. I'm just pulling these numbers out of the air. Well, if you were psychologically more healthy because your parents negotiated with you instead of beating your ass, you might have had the skills to say, you know what, my important thing in life is to make a lot of money. How can I maximize that? And maybe you have a job making $200,000 right now as an executive in a company. You would have went down that route because you're going to be able to make more as an executive in a company than you are as an airline pilot. You know what I mean? I don't. You just don't know because that didn't happen to you. What you do know is that kids that are spanked tend to be more aggressive. Kids that are spanked tend to have criminal records a lot more than people who don't. You know what I mean? Kids, they tend to have more success in relationships. They kids that are not spanked, I should say. You know, they tend to be happier in various social tests. You know, there's the mountain of evidence is out there. So, and you don't know what you would have turned out to be had you not been spanked. You'll never know that. But that doesn't invalidate the argument.
Right. And, you know, I have an issue with this because we're really talking about virtue in a way. We're not really talking about, I'm not sure what an airliner pilot has to do with what we're discussing. The argument is not that hitting people will mean they're on welfare for their entire life. There are tons of people, right, who are beat and abused. And it doesn't even need to be corporal punishment. You can be sexually abused. You can be assaulted by somebody who has mugged you. A lot of bad things can happen to you that damage you emotionally and psychologically. Yet you are one of the wealthiest people in the world, right? Nobody is arguing that like being an airliner pilot is not a qualifier for being a healthy person or like a virtuous person. Rarely drinking. All right, that is one factor. Maybe you rarely drink, but you have a gambling problem, right? There's a lot of things that we could look at. So none of these things that he's listed is really meaningful in the realm of being a good person or a virtuous person.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I mean, it's when you make this argument, I turned out all right. You have to ask, I guess, for one, what is your measuring stick?
Right.
You know, and in general, we're not, you know, being successful, success is how you define it. You know, so you could define success as, well, I really want a job that makes me a lot of money, and then you have a measuring stick. Another way could be, you know what, I want a job where I'm happy, and I don't really care about money as long as I have a roof over my head and food on the table. And there's a different measuring stick for that. Yeah, the I turned out all right thing, and, you know, we're not really even talking about that this is the way to maximize, you know, nowhere in there did you say this is the way to maximize dollars or anything like that. It's more just maximizing psychological health of your children and the quality of your relationship. I don't know that was explicitly declared anywhere in there, but to me, the reason I'm trying my best to implement these tactics of peaceful parenting is for the emotional and psychological health of my child, to maximize that, their happiness, and that is going to enable them to be in a better place to reach whatever their goals are, to whatever they define as being successful. If my daughter decides that she wants to be an airline pilot, the more I use these skills with her and keep her psychologically healthy, the better she's going to be able to meet, you know, to reach those goals, whatever that may be that she sets for herself.
Right.
You know?
And I kind of see this argument and people who make this argument as they're trying to defend the status quo rather than afford children a voice or advance the cause of children's rights or, just really think critically about their own behavior. Am I being a hypocrite? Yes, because I don't want to be hit by others, yet I suggest that it's okay to hit others. That's hypocritical by nature. So they're really, by making this argument, they're just getting in the way. They're gambling with their child's well-being, saying, well, you haven't proved that this is a destructive thing in all cases. So it's quite possible that children may escape it and be wildly successful and not damaged. But that's still a gamble. Like, why don't we just turn the discussion towards optimizing the health and well-being of children by not hitting them? We could be, talking about how to do that. Instead, we're arguing about I don't even know what we're arguing about. We're just arguing that this doesn't apply in all cases. And, when we've showed that it applies in a lot of cases.
And it shows a lack of critical thinking, and it's another real case of being hypocritical, because I would be willing to bet that this person would not say, you know what, smoking doesn't guarantee that you get lung cancer. There's, 20-30% of people who smoke. I'm just pulling that number out of the air, mind you, but I think it's at least that high. It may even be higher than that. 20-30 people who smoke don't get lung cancer. So fuck it. Why not? Why not smoke?
Right.
You know, there's no reason not to smoke. You know, that's basically what they're equating it to, is because he turned it out all right, which is debatable. But even if we just say, okay, let's say you did. Let's say for some cases people turn out just fine and there's no problem from this. That means we can ignore all the evidence of the cases where it actually doesn't work in your favor. It's like saying that just because there are instances where you don't get lung cancer, that means we can ignore all the cases where you do. And I bet you anything, this person would never make that argument.
Right. I think this is the composition or division fallacy, right? Where you assume that because one part of something is true, like in order to be valid, it must be true for everybody, everywhere. And that's not the case. He even said that in, let me go back to his argument here. He said, you assume that everyone that got spanked and tells others that he's fine is automatically lying to you or fucked up in the mind or repressing a trauma. I never said everyone. I didn't try to make the argument that this applies to everybody, which is why he said in the beginning, who are you to comment on my mental health? I'm not commenting on your mental health, Bob, or whatever your name is. I'm just making a general statement. And I'm not insisting that this applies to everybody across the board. I don't have research that shows that 100% of people turn out like X. So I'm not making that argument. And, to try to expand my argument to fill that 100% it's dishonest.
They're not making that argument from a place of reason or critical thinking. It's, like we said, it's an emotion-based argument. If they accept the argument that spanking damages children, then what does that tell them about their parents? It's like their parents may have damaged me. I might be damaged. My parents might be the kind of person that would damage a child. I don't want to have to deal with that, so let me see if I can find some way to just dismiss this.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, that was the last comment. I do want to say that I think this was a really productive conversation. I think that what you added was extremely valuable, and I'm glad that we did it, and we're probably going to have to break this up into 2 segments to make sure everybody is able to get the whole thing in.
Yeah, no, it's been a lot of fun doing it, and I really appreciate the opportunity to discuss it with you. So I'm really thrilled that the article is getting so much traction, and it's, you really did a great job putting it together. I had my criticisms that I delivered along the way, but
well, they were valid. They were valid criticisms.
Right. I mean, it's one of those things where sometimes one approach works for one person where another approach works for somebody else. So I might have success convincing a few people using one method, and you might have success convincing some others using a different method that my method wouldn't have worked. So, at the end of the day, we're just trying to help people, and especially help out those little kids out there who don't have the freedoms that an adult has in our culture. So if your method ended up leading to the word getting out a little more and more people getting exposed to these arguments, then who am I to sit here and say it was the wrong thing for you to do, which I don't think I ever did anywhere in there. I just said it's not necessarily how I would have made the points.
Right. And, I will say that because of this article and a couple others, we have now over 110 new people in the Reboot Your Kids Facebook group who we are going to be able to have discussions with. And, it's going to be a different tone inside of that group. It always is a different tone inside of that group because this wasn't written for people who are trying to, really dive in and do a lot of this deep work. So, we did expand the community. We did expand the amount of people who are going to be exposed to this. We did expand the amount of children who may not be hit now, who may not be treated so destructively. So I think that all in all, it was a productive outcome.
Yeah, I agree with that. Absolutely.
Cool. All right, man. Well, thank you so much. And we will probably be recording a new episode soon, so everybody stay tuned.
Because I'm the wanderer. Yeah, I'm the wanderer. Roam around and round and round and round. Take it, Mark! around the town, live life without a care. I'm as happy as a clown, with my 2 fists of iron, but I'm going nowhere. I'm the type of guy who never settles down. The pretty girls are, know that I'm around. Kiss them and I love them, 'cause to me they're all the same. I hug them and I squeeze them, they don't even know my name. They call me the Wanderer, yeah, I'm the Wanderer. I roam around and round and round and round. Yeah, I'm the Wanderer, yeah, I'm the Wanderer. I roam around and round and round and round. One more time, 'cause I'm